Hello.
Good evening, folks.
Good evening and welcome.
Good to see you all.
Fantastic to see you all, guys.
Yeah.
And welcome to those who are joining us for the first time. Welcome to SDS Thursday. I think we're going to have a big group today, and that's really, really good to see. It's still freezing in this country, but let us just ask you a question. Start typing. Let us know where you are in the world. Are you in the UK, and what part of the UK, and whether it is as freezing as it is here. This morning it was +3, and the heating already switched for the summer sort of setting, and I had to switch it back to the winter setting because +3 is truly a winter temperature. So, but please let us know where you are in the world, and I will ask you all my regular questions. What is your professional background? All the other participants really like to read the chat, and you probably know it yourself because it's always nice to see who is in the room. So where you are in the world, and what is your professional background, and why you're interested in tonight's topic. And tonight we will be talking about narcissism, the topic which is not often covered in psychological training. Why are you interested in this topic? Have you had any training in this topic? And what kind of training? Was it part of your degree? And also, I always ask you a question, have you been to SDS Thursdays before? Because we've been running them since 2020. And actually, April 2020, our first lockdown, remember, was fantastic in terms of the weather. It was such a warm April. And for some reason, because we were advised not to go outside, we all went for long walks, remember, in very remote areas, but we all went for long walks in the glorious sunshine, April 2020, and it's freezing April 2024. I'll keep this information so when 4 years down the line we watch this video, we'll be able to remember. So we started it in 2020, and I'm sure many of you have been with us right from the beginning. But if it is your first SDS Thursday, please let us know, how did you learn about it? What helped you to make a decision to come and join us tonight? And also whether you've been to any SDS courses, because SDS Thursdays are offered to you by SDS seminars. These events are absolutely free, but we also have not so free events, but different range from quite expensive to very affordable events. And whether you've been to any SDS courses and what courses are particularly memorable, what courses you remember particularly well. I can see supervision is already mentioned. Yes, one of our most popular and best courses is clinical supervision. So while we're still gathering, Paul, if you don't mind, just to keep an eye on the waiting room, because I'll share my screen with you and just tell you a few things about the course. We are a psychological skills training company for mental health practitioners. We've been running since 1990 as SDS seminars. And to find our website, you go to skillsdevelopment.co.uk. And if you're watching this recording on YouTube, I will put a QR code probably somewhere in this area. I will put a QR code for you to scan it and to come to our website. And today we will be talking about working with narcissism course, and it's very easy to find. So either you click on May the 10th, working with narcissism here, or you click on featured course because it is our featured course. And I'll tell you a funny story. For 2 months, it was hanging there with me making a mistake and writing book with a dangerous discount rather than generous discount. Nobody noticed it. So it was a dangerous discount for 2 months, but now it's changed to a generous discount. So working with narcissism. We start the course on the 10th of May, and it will run for 3 weeks, once a week, only 3 days altogether, and it only runs for 3 hours a day. So we start at 9 in the morning and run it until midday. So 9 to 12, once a week, 10th of May, 17th of May, and 24th of May. If you can't come to one or more than one of these sessions, you will receive a recording after the course, and we will make sure that you will receive a recording before the next session. So if you missed the first session, you will receive a recording of the first session before the second. So you'll be able to watch it and to come to the next session already prepared. If you can't come on any of these days, this course can be watched as a recording. So because there won't be that much participation in it, I don't know if any, Paul will tell us, so you can actually watch this course as a recording. So this is working with narcissism, 3 parts, 3 days, once a week, 3 hours each session. So you have the afternoon free for you, so you can do see your clients and do other things. I'm very happy to introduce my co-director, Paul Grantham, who will be leading the course and who will be talking with us about narcissism tonight. So Paul, my first question to you. As I said already, it's not your usual topic for training of mental health professionals. I mean, it's not your depression or anxiety, you know what I mean, or health anxiety. It's something which is quite prominent in popular culture. You know, if you go on Facebook or Twitter, there's narcissist here, narcissist there, everybody's attributing this term to everyone they don't like. Basically, if they don't like somebody, they are of course all narcissists. So why you've decided to focus on it, and what do you give us some different spin from what is sort of quite common in the popular culture?
Yeah, thanks very much, Julia, and welcome, folks. Yeah, I just say a little bit about what drew me to this as a topic area, really. As you and many others may well know, I've got a general interest in what might be broadly termed client motivation, and particularly about how to work with poorly motivated clients. And I guess that I was partly drawn to this particular area because of that, and narcissistic characteristics, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment, do tend to represent quite a challenge, I think, for therapists in terms of their poor motivation. So that's sort of where I sort of got into this. That issue about motivational problems also overlapped with something else that I've been particularly interested in, probably over the last, I don't know, couple of years, which is what could be broadly described as early dropouts from therapy. My interest in this really started off with the data that was coming out from the IAPT and now Talking Therapies evaluations, which found that somewhere between about 15 and 20% of clients dropped out by session 2 in therapy. And there's a tendency in the evaluation data to discount that group of people, but I was actually interested in that from a different angle, which was, why was people's motivation not sufficiently great to stay in therapy? And although my attention was drawn to this within IAPT, to be honest with you, I started being quite interested in it within my own therapy sessions, and also as well in the therapy sessions that my supervisees would bring along. And I think what I just want to say about that is that in all instances, there tends to be a tendency to dismiss these people. They tend to be classified as being poorly motivated, not engaged, whatever. And to be honest with you, because they drop out quite quickly, they don't, generally speaking, I think, create any sense of anxiety in practitioners, which would lead them to bring them along, for instance, to supervision. So that was part of my early interest and about how I got into this, because for reasons I'll go into a bit more detail about at the moment, it struck me that there was this group of people who had characteristics or personality attributes which made them more likely to drop out early on. And I think there's a tendency, not just because people they don't make therapists feel anxious, because I hate to say it, there's a little bit of out of sight, out of mind. But I think for that reason, there's not really been much attention given to how to engage these folk. I think the general assumption was they're not interested, they're not motivated, what can you do about it, and so on and so forth. So that was sort of one angle. The second angle was I was quite struck by the fact that there are some folks that you can be working with in therapy and who engage well, or at least appear to engage well, who are also, if you're using therapeutic tasks, for instance, can appear to be quite compliant and appear, in inverted commas, to be saying the right things, feeling the right things, doing the right things, but they don't change. And I've always found that to be an interesting challenge, I guess. And finally, there's the whole thing about how we as therapists respond to the personalities of the clients that we've actually got in front of us. And there are certainly some individuals that we experience as being difficult in some particular way. And I think that our reaction to them, what obviously many people will call countertransference, but our reaction to them and our response to them often means that we don't want to look at them in any great detail. There's also a subgroup as well who usually are not seen as a challenge, but actually the opposite. They're often experienced as being very pleasant and engaging and often very articulate. But where actually, again, there may be elements in our own reaction to them, which really, in all honesty, needs to be looked at and managed. So putting all of that together, I guess I was quite interested in it from a motivational perspective, which led me into starting to look at this, because the thing that actually struck me, and I suspect is the case for practically everybody here this evening, generally speaking, you do not get people being referred for narcissism. And you certainly don't get people coming along saying, I have a narcissistic personality, please help me. So that raises a really interesting question about, do we actually see these people? They exist in the literature, but I would hasten to add that that literature is almost overwhelmingly American. And in addition to that, as you rightly pointed out earlier on, they exist in popular culture as well. And I guess that's sort of where I put the two together and where I started to get interested. Because that sort of presentation of someone in that particular way, of coming along and saying, you know, I've got narcissistic problems, is near enough unknown, to be honest. So for that particular reason, we only are likely to experience them indirectly. So we experience them indirectly through some of these motivational issues that I mentioned. But can I just hasten to add, it is relatively uncommon in my experience for therapists to say, some of these things that I'm seeing here are basically narcissistic characteristics.
That's a very good point, because I wanted to ask you this question a little bit more sort of specifically, because we have 126 people sitting here, and if people are not coming to them with a complaint of being a narcissist, I think they don't, and maybe very, very few of them are referred to them as for that particular problem. So why this topic is relevant to the people in this room? So as counselors, as therapists, as psychologists, how they can be aware of it, and secondly, how they can guess that maybe somehow what they see is affected by underlying narcissism. How can it present itself to a day-to-day practice?
Okay, well, there's a number of ways of thinking about this. The first one is that a lot of folks with narcissistic characteristics will come into therapy with a different presenting problem. So they will come in because they're depressed, they'll come in because they're anxious. We also know that there's quite a big overlap as well with eating problems. There's also quite a big overlap as well with perfectionism as well. So what will typically happen is that individuals will come along with another presenting problem. Another common one, which you may come across, is an individual who has got relationship difficulties of some type. So that's why they actually come along. And not surprisingly, the natural inclination of the therapist is to focus on that and to probably draw on existing theories about how that problem's come into being. So that's how people come in, I think. In terms of how to recognize them, can I just say something here before I go any further? I don't actually like the use of the term narcissist. It's a labeling term, and I prefer to talk about narcissistic beliefs and behaviors, because they also operate on a spectrum, can I emphasize here as well. So let me just say a little bit about some of the behaviors, attitudes, beliefs of folks who have these particular characteristics. And these are not in any particular order. And I'm not suggesting either that every time you see these particular things I'm about to mention, that this automatically means that there's a narcissistic problem there. But some of the things you might want to look out for: boundary testing. How far can I go? A strong sense of the individual believing themselves to be exceptional. Now, what does that tend to mean? It tends to mean that they are probably more prone to both asking for and expecting favors. They are expected to be treated differently. They typically see their circumstances as quite unique as well. And there is a general, what might be broadly termed, low-level paranoia that's around. So if there's a problem, it's somebody else that's causing this. It's not about me. It's about somebody else or other people. And that sort of, unfortunately, also manifests itself in quite a dichotomous attitude towards people generally. So broadly speaking, there is a tendency to see individuals as either being for them or against them. So there's sort of no middle ground there at all. This in turn, can I just say, exists in a number of different ways. I think that probably most commonly, and what is probably focused on the most in the literature, is what might be broadly termed extrovert narcissists. These are folks typically who are loud, rather vain, attention-seeking, tend to be ambitious at the expense of others. Although, can I also hasten to add that they can also be very sociable, charming, and well-liked as well. But they're still prone to victimhood. And I think particularly importantly, which is an issue which I think will commonly crop up in therapy, is they are very, very sensitive indeed to anything that they might construe as a criticism. So if you actually see the world as being full of people who are either for you or against you, anything which is a challenge, even in the smallest way, is experienced as an attack. Now, I do want to sorry to make this seem a bit complicated, but I'm just trying to get through this within a short period of time, really, before we open it up in more detail in the training. But what I would say is that these are often termed extrovert narcissists, and in their most extreme form, this tends to manifest itself as narcissistic personality disorder. But I think in all honesty, for a whole range of reasons that I'll go into when we actually come to the training, I'm not advocating that we work with those people who suffer from NPD. What I'm suggesting instead is that we look out for these characteristics and look to manage them. So what you might see, for instance, in front of you is someone who's a bad listener, someone who makes a lot of what are called upward social comparisons. So they're always comparing themselves to other people who they either see as being more successful or better than them, and for that particular reason they see them quite negatively, or alternatively they wish to aspire to being like that in some particular way. There's a continuous focus on winning, but also when I use the term winning here, that expresses itself in a number of different ways as well. And there's a general sense of entitlement, which is probably not that surprising if you've got individuals who think that they ought to be treated exceptionally. Now that's the classic sort of presentation of narcissism, which I think most people tend to assume, particularly when it's in its NPD form. And I also suspect that unless you are working, and I'm quite happy to open up why this is later on, unless you're working with adolescents or you're working with offenders in a secure environment, you're not likely to see this extreme form occurring. But you are likely to see more moderate forms of it. So in that respect, it's just worth keeping your eyes open for. There are actually, can I say, formal methods of assessing this. And although I've got quite mixed feelings towards formal assessment tools, this is one area where I think there's a very, very strong argument for using them for everybody at the beginning of therapy. And I think one of the key reasons for that is because people don't present and say, this is my problem. And also, it's not necessarily self-evident. And I've certainly come across a lot of people who I supervise who are working with people who've got stuck with them in some particular way. And at no point have they thought to themselves, this is partly due to narcissistic characteristics. So I think it's just worth having some formal evaluation method, which we will go into more detail about on the actual training day. So you will come across these particular characteristics. It's worth just adding, by the way, unless you were to, just in case you're assuming that, you know, all narcissists are a bit like Donald Trump, there are other sort of presentations which are worth being aware of. So there is a term called introverted narcissism, which is not as loud and proud as the extroverted form, which I mentioned earlier. These are typically individuals who are much quieter. They may be quite passive or passive aggressive. They, however, still generally believe that they're exceptional, and on the whole, believe that they have unrecognized gifts or intelligence. They often feel they have a better understanding of the world and a better understanding of others, but they are still showing that same attitude towards being victims and being oversensitive to criticisms. And probably not surprisingly, apart from, and I should have mentioned this earlier on, really, apart from these attitudes and beliefs being expressed towards others outside of the therapy room, there are chances that they are going to be manifested towards you. Ultimately, narcissistic characteristics, I think above anything else, are about beliefs and behaviors in relationships with other people. So, you know, with regards to this sort of idea of introverted narcissistic characteristics, these would often manifest themselves with clients basically challenging your approach, believing that you don't necessarily have a full understanding of things, will often incidentally do a lot of reading themselves, and like to share that, and they like to test out whether you've read the same things or you haven't read the same things, and so on and so forth. There's one other type as well that I just briefly want to mention and touch on, because I think in my experience it's the presentation narcissistic characteristics which is most commonly invisible, I think not just to therapists but also to people generally, and it's called communal narcissism. And this is basically, again, a set of beliefs about being exceptional, but these are quite different. This is the belief that the individual is more nurturing, more understanding, and more empathetic than other people. In other words, they see themselves as exceptional in their level of caring towards other people. So not surprisingly, and they tend to cherish, I think, in many ways, their status as givers. And they may or may not directly express that, but they will probably express it through some degree of prompting or question asking. And because such individuals, particularly when they're being seen in the cocooned bubble of a therapy room, and this by the way is a general challenge with working with these characteristics, is we are typically, as therapists, very, very reliant on the self-report that the client provides us with. So what the client is saying about themselves, their world, and other people, we understandably have a natural inclination to take at face value. So when somebody is basically giving a narrative about their attitude of caring towards others, of looking after others, of being concerned about others, there is a natural inclination on the whole, I think, to buy into that, and it becomes even more invisible. If you've actually got clients who present in that particular way, all I would say is be on the lookout for this, because again, that potentially creates problems rather than solving.
Well, it's fascinating. Even just these three types of narcissistic behavior are fascinating. And when you mentioned about the communal narcissists who are looking after others, maybe they also look after the whole planet, or they look after, you know what I mean? We have quite a lot of that currently. So just a few questions very quickly from the chat box. In terms of presenting of narcissistic tendencies, are they gender related at all?
Good question. There is a big gender split on narcissistic personality disorder. So males present much more commonly with this, but, and this is a very big but, that is only at the personality disorder end of things. When you're looking at more moderate to high, but not extreme expressions of narcissistic characteristics, there do not appear to be any gender splits. Interestingly enough as well, there's that sort of gender split in its extreme form really tends to only apply to that loud presentation that I mentioned earlier on, that introvert characteristics, when they're presented, and also communal ones, there does not appear to be any gender difference between the two.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. And also you are talking about this whole spectrum, you know, before you get to narcissistic personality disorder. And there's another question about the spectrum, is autism. And this is a question from Jeffrey. This black and white thinking, they are for me or they're against me, can be presented in autism. How narcissism relates or doesn't or presents itself with autistic clients.
Okay, so I think the first thing I would want to say on this, and again, it depends on the degree of severity. But if you're just looking broadly speaking at narcissistic characteristics that interfere with functioning in the broadest sense, then we're talking up to about a quarter of the population. So the first thing I would want to emphasize here is don't assume that one automatically equals the other. It doesn't. It's a much larger group. It does not deny the fact that autistic folks can also have narcissistic characteristics, but there are some quite specific elements within narcissism which are not typically shared or seen certainly as characteristics of autism. And can I just say, it's another good reason for having a formal tool for assessment on this, because it will help to make that sort of distinction. But I do take the point that that extremity or that polarization is common amongst autistic folk. But you are going to find here there's a lot of other things around which I wouldn't see as being particularly typical. Things like the boundary testing that actually goes on, I wouldn't see as being particularly typical of autism. And also the exceptionalism in terms of the way in which it presents in this, I wouldn't assume either. But yes, you're quite right that you will get both in some folks, but I would be wary of automatically jumping in and saying, this is an issue relating to autism here. Indeed, I've had a couple of instances, certainly in supervision, of supervisees who have talked about clients and wondered whether the part of the problem was undiagnosed autism, but where in actual fact, when we took it apart and looked at it in more detail, it's actually about narcissistic characteristics. And I will re-emphasize this point. I know I keep making it, but I'll re-emphasize it again. It is a very strong argument for having a simple but accurate method of actually assessing, really, which is one of the things we will look at on the training day. Yeah.
Fantastic questions in the chat box. I don't know whether I'll be able to ask them all, but for example, this is a question about, or just a thought. Do you think we're all narcissistic in fact, in the modern world of individualism?
Right, where to start with this? The first thing I want to say about it is, and again, Donald Trump's got a lot to answer for, but one of the things he's got to answer for is the fact that people tend to equate narcissism with that particular expression of it. And I hope I've already emphasized it is one particular expression, but it is not the only one. That's the first thing I want to make. The second point I want to make is that a certain level of narcissism is healthy. There is nothing dysfunctional about it. It's more to do with its severity and the way in which it's expressed. So in that particular respect, for instance, if we take one very obvious area here, most parents would wish their children to be treated exceptionally. And that if somebody came along and said they're just like any other child, when actually we feel that they ought to go to the head of the queue, for instance, that things are not being recognized about them, which are very, very unique and valuable. There's that element in all of us. And wouldn't we want to have that in a parent? Wouldn't we want to have that attitude towards our children? It's also worth saying that there are big problems with the exact opposite of narcissism, something called egoism, which I will say a little bit more about, obviously, on the training days. But I guess at a very basic level, a medium level of narcissism is healthy. That's as soon as that phrase comes out of my mouth, I feel it's a gross oversimplification, but it gives a broad idea about it. So yeah, the problems lie at the extreme is the first thing to say. The other thing to say, and this is really interesting, I think, is in order to try and encourage people not to see this as a bad, pathological, alien way of seeing the world, it's worth saying that the vast majority of individuals tend to find that their natural healthy narcissism tends to amplify and become more extreme in certain circumstances. So two obvious examples of this are pregnancy and threat of redundancy. So for instance, you know, what you'll often find, if we take a redundancy example, is that people might be told that, you know, we have a first in, first out policy here, or we are going to be getting rid of certain departments, and that's the equitable way of doing it. If you are somebody who's on the receiving end of that, you feel that you ought to be made an exception of. They don't realize what they're losing with me. My God, why are they getting rid of so-and-so who's so much worse than me? I'm so much better, etc. And again, I hope you can see that, you know, with pregnancy, you don't want to be treated like any other mother or any other prospective mother. You want to have the very best for you and your unborn child. So it's worth just saying that during times of stress, whatever people's natural healthy narcissism is it tends to get pushed to extremes naturally. So yes, an absence of narcissism is a bad thing. Having too much of it's a bad thing. The healthy bit is somewhere in the middle. We'll talk a little bit more about what that consists of on the training. But in addition to that, even if we have a healthy narcissistic set of characteristics, in certain key points, we think that we should be treated exceptionally. And very often we will do whatever we need to do to get treated exceptionally as well. And that's quite natural. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because Ian is saying exactly that, and he said it before you mentioned it. Isn't a certain amount of narcissism necessary in normal development?
Yeah.
So that's absolutely true. I liked a question which Claire is asking: are therapists likely to be communal narcissists?
Sorry, are
therapists likely to be communal narcissists? Or is there a chance
I wouldn't want to go that far.
People are attracted to certain professions?
I wouldn't want to go that far. I think there are some, yes. I think that's certainly true. I'm not sure I'd make that much of a generalization. Interestingly enough, if you were to say to me, where do you see communal narcissists the most, it will be within certain social media groups. So yeah, I think there are certain places, not surprising, I mean, that people gravitate towards. And I think there are some practitioners who are communal narcissists. Can I also say, however, there are some individuals that I come across who are classic extrovert narcissists as well. Anybody that you are working with who has got a very high status job and who has been very ambitious to get there, and in order to get to that particular position has had to be loud and proud and fight for that, and is not always straightforward in their approach. You're going to find that there as well. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's move on from there to actually the questions about therapy.
Yeah.
And what can be done about narcissistic individuals if they come to therapy? Does the problem of narcissism needs to be addressed itself, or we are dealing with other issues which are presented but bearing it in mind? So what can be done about it? As therapists, how can we deal with that?
Okay, I think this is a really good question. I think the first thing to say is to basically repeat what I said earlier, which is in its most extreme form, I personally would leave well alone. So there's not many people that I would say, or many problems I would say don't work with, but NPD is undoubtedly one of them. And can I say, I think for most people here, they're not likely to come across them in the first place anyway. But what you are likely to come across is obviously people with narcissistic characteristics who basically present for other reasons. So do you get involved with it? Well, apart from not making it your primary target, and I do want to emphasize that, what I would say is this: there's two ways in which you might be making a decision about getting involved with it. The first one is one which is again very close to my heart over the issue of motivation, which is when these narcissistic beliefs interfere with therapy in some way. So taking a concept from dialectical behavior therapy, when you've got these beliefs expressing themselves as therapy interfering behaviors. So non-compliance, inconsistency in attendance, every conversation feels like it's a battle, you feel that there is some sort of power struggle in the room, which is expressing itself, which is interfering. So I think in that respect, it potentially needs to be addressed. And of course, the other one is if there is or not so much if there is, there's a high chance that it is, but you are going to need to be thinking about dealing with the presenting problem as it interfaces with narcissistic characteristics. So let me just give you an example of that just to illustrate what I mean. So somebody may come along feeling very depressed, and they present with a lot of the usual characteristics of being depressed, which also may well focus on their relationships with other people. And actually, this mood problem that they're presenting with is actually directly tied into some of their narcissistic beliefs. So to take an obvious example here, if I believe that I should be treated exceptionally, and people are not treating me exceptionally, and I get depressed as a result of that, then those particular narcissistic type beliefs would need to be looked at. Equally, if somebody comes along with a relationship-based problem, which incidentally they are likely to either, I was going to say unsubtly, but often very subtly as well, present as primarily lying with the other person. But actually we discover that some of their own beliefs about the other person, for instance, maybe their belief that they're not praised all the time by somebody that they're in a relationship with, and that this person is always very highly critical of them and never gives them any positive feedback, is actually their perception based on a belief, and that this interferes with their ability to have that relationship, then again, that would be one of the areas where we would actually want to look at some of those narcissistic type beliefs as they impact on the presenting problem. But I would be very wary indeed of, in a sense, treating narcissism as a problem. Can I just say on the positive side of this, because I know this does sound and can sound very complicated, can I just say that for anybody who is coming at these sorts of problems with, for example, a CBT background, you're going to find that all the usual strategies, techniques, tools, approaches that you might be using to challenge any particular unhelpful belief are equally applicable here as well. So in that respect, it's not, in terms of what you do, it's not fundamentally, I mean, there is an order to these things, and the things that you're going to focus on and the things you're not going to focus on, I think is you know, it's a bit more complicated, but the actual strategies, I think, are very similar. One other thing I should actually just say about this, which I think some of you will naturally will naturally buy into anyway, but I suspect not all of you do, is that because this is fundamentally about beliefs in relation to self and other people, you are going to find these beliefs and behaviors directed towards yourself. And it's worth just saying that because people with narcissistic characteristics are often quite skilled at finding people's soft spots and using them to achieve their ends, they will be on the lookout for those in you. And you will also be having your own emotional and cognitive reactions to the client as well. So it is not unusual for collusive relationships to occur. And for that particular reason, I think having an awareness of your own feelings and beliefs towards the client in this particular context, and also knowing how you're going to approach it and manage it, is really quite fundamental. Because the danger is, can I say, the danger is potentially going off in one of two directions. You either experience the client as being unpleasant in some particular way, and you have a conscious or unconscious desire to not wish to have contact with them, and they decide to leave. They don't think you're good enough, by the way, but that's not your perception. You just don't, you're not that, think it's a shame, but, thank goodness that's over. But there's also a collusive relationship that can actually occur as well. Particularly, I think, if you have, and I know nobody ever wants to, actually, let me tell you about the bits that that therapists are willing to own that you've got to be looking out for. If you are a natural optimist, if you think there's always the good in people, and that all you've got to do is to reach out and to find it, you will find that you are vulnerable to some degree, and that will need managing. So that's one particular issue. If any of you know, I know that you will all probably say this is not something that's desirable, and I would agree with you, but if you know in yourself that you have a natural tendency to wish to rescue as well, you're going to find that there's vulnerability here too. And also, I think, because the self-presentation as victim is so potentially seductive, I think, to therapists, there's also a danger there too. So what you feel and believe about the client is I think, very fundamental in doing this work, whatever modality you're working with. Because it's going to, if you're not careful, it's going to lead you to be blind to certain beliefs that the person has, which interface with their problem, and which, as far as you're concerned, are totally invisible. So I think that's that's not about sort of the therapy work per se, but it is about our relationship with the person, because the beliefs that cause them the problem are about themselves and their relationship with other people.
And from what I hear, it also our own set of beliefs,
yes,
which will affect the way we perceive the client.
Oh, totally.
So there was a question there that if narcissists projecting their superior beliefs on you, is that the only way is to change the client, or for them to change the therapist? What would you say would be the first step if you are coming across the client towards whom you feel those particular emotions you described? Would it be to take this case into supervision as a first step? How would you
well, I'm probably going to go a step further than that and say, if on initial assessment these characteristics present themselves, and you can see where there is what appears to be an interface between that and the presenting problem, or potential problems with doing the therapy per se, then I think you need to automatically keep a close eye. I mean, part of this is determined by how extreme and severe it is. But I think at the very least, there should be some initial checking out that occurs in supervision. And if you can spot particular emotional engagement with the client on the basis of these characteristics, then I think that basically it needs to be a recurrent case that's looked at. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jonathan is giving an interesting example of working on Zoom with one of the clients of this kind, who decided to start making a meal in his kitchen during the session. And when he was challenged about it, got very upset and blamed the therapist. So that's probably one of the classic examples. I am very aware of the time, and I just wanted to mention that the course is 3 sessions of 3 hours, so it's 9 hours altogether. So obviously Paul will be able to go much more into the details, both in terms of the characteristics which you will be discussing and the things to be on the lookout for, and also on therapeutic work with this type of clients and what to be aware of. And I think on the last day of the 3 sessions, you are actually talking not just about working with the narcissistic clients themselves, but working with those who are in that sort of relationships with their partners who have those characteristics, and sort of tips in terms of how to deal with this type of people, both in work environment, because we probably know colleagues who are like that, or bosses who are like that, or with family members. Just say a few words about that so people know what to expect.
Right. So the first thing I want to reiterate is that all of this is on the spectrum. So don't make the automatic assumption that this is, you know, unchangeable bad news to be in that particular position. What I can say is managing people with these characteristics is easier according to the greater emotional distance that you have from them. So not surprisingly, it's actually easier to develop a strategy, for instance, with your boss, than it would be with your lover or partner. And indeed, one of the things I think makes dealing with a relationship with somebody who presents with these characteristics, apart from the severity of them, is the level of intimacy in the relationship. So that's the first thing I guess I want to say. Secondly, it is on the spectrum, as I said, and there are particular things that can be done, which are really quite good. I mean, gosh, this gets so complicated, but are quite good tests of knowing whether the relationship is salvageable, basically. So there's a concept called empathy prompts, which I'll be outlining to you and also going through how they can be used. And they are a useful in-relationship test for basically seeing whether this relationship is workable with or not. And I think for me, that was a really useful discovery, particularly, can I hasten to add, in romantic relationships, where very often I think the assumption is that if I am in a relationship with someone demonstrating these sort of characteristics, really the only option is leaving. That may be the answer, by the way, but it is not the only answer. And there are ways of testing out and potentially changing the nature of that relationship in less severe instances. I should also add, of course, that even if really the only option is to leave, then we have a whole different set of issues that need to be addressed. Because very often we might have clients who know that this relationship is not changeable. They've tried in different ways, and they may have tried with you as a therapist as well, but come to the conclusion that that change is not possible. But they don't leave because of a whole series of beliefs that they have about themselves and also the relationship, which get in the way. So in those particular instances, the focus then becomes obviously the beliefs that the individual who is on the receiving end of this behavior needs to look at in more detail. It is worth, I said earlier that we'll be going into some degree of detail about what's called echoism, but there is often a tendency, particularly in romantic relationships, for people with the more severe narcissistic characteristics to be drawn to individuals who demonstrate echoistic characteristics, and also, can I hasten to add, vice versa as well. So it's tricky, but I do want, and one thing this is something else I should have mentioned earlier on. The outcome literature on working with narcissism is not large, but it does exist. And I certainly know of around about 12 to 15 controlled studies that have looked at effectively helping people to change their behavior and belief systems when they're presenting with these particular sorts of behaviors and characteristics. So what I'm trying to say here is it's not a lost cause automatically. And although getting out of a relationship might be the only option, there's a whole series of other things you can do in between. The other problem, of course, is individuals who are in such a relationship could be with a romantic partner, but it could well, for instance, be with a manager, and in some instances within a family where it's just not possible to leave. You know, there is no other job to go to. And what do you do in that situation? You know, even though the behavior is totally and utterly unchangeable, what do you do? How do you survive, basically? And we'll be looking at that as well.
Yeah, that last point I think is very, very important, because again, it's sort of like common wisdom dictates you walk away from a narcissist, but it's not always possible. It could be your parent, it could be your child, it could be your boss. There are so many situations when you need to find a much more workable strategy. And I'm glad that you're going to talk about it. There were a couple of questions about narcissism and age, both in terms of, I don't want you to answer them now because we are coming to the end, but just to tell us both about young narcissism and also narcissism of elderly people. Will you be touching upon that on the course?
Yes. If you want a brief answer,
clear answer. Thank you. Thank you. Well, we are coming up to 8 o'clock very quickly. I know there were more questions, and I will pass them all to Paul so he could incorporate them into the course. But as I said, you have 9 hours of this when you come to the course. And if you book tonight, you still have your 20% discount. And then you know our sort of decremental discounting program, so they go down, down, down. So eventually they'll come to the full price. Before we say goodbye, yes, thank you. I want you to ask to write a few words of comment in the chat box, so I could probably use them in our course materials. So if you enjoyed this topic, if it prompted some interesting thought process in you, please just write it in the chat box. I put the link to the course into the chat box, and you obviously all know how to find our website. I hope to see you on those 3 days. And now you can unmute yourself, say your goodbyes, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care, folks. Good to see you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Take care. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Look after yourself.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
It was
Take
good
care.
to see you all. Thank you for
Yeah, it's
coming.
good to see you all. Yeah. You take
Bye.
Bye.